which is, when I was little, I was the interpreter for my family. Because I spoke English and they didn't. And when we came to the States, I was the interpreter. So who taught me how to interpret?
Yourself.
Myself. And what did I use? My intuition. My intuition. So I became an intuitive interpreter. And my intuition, for instance, would tell me that if a person asked a long-winded question, always there was a little bit of a question and the rest was just what I call in Spanish, paja, straw, nothing. Right? Right. Meaning, hey, please go ask the lady that is sitting behind the desk, the one with the nice, beautiful hair, ask her, well, all that was paja. Right? They really, it was unimportant to my mission. Ask her, where is the bathroom? That was the question. Now don't ask it out loud because you don't want to embarrass me. That was paja again. Right? So I would go and say, where's the bathroom? Now the lady might give me a long-winded answer full of paja. Well, we have 2 restrooms because we're very proud in this hotel. We have the best restrooms in town. You know, they're very clean. It depends. Do you want to climb stairs or not? Right? One is over there. And for me, again, the answer was, one's over there, one's over here. That was the answer. When I came back to my relative, that's all I would say. So I asked this question, where's the bathroom? And I transmitted this answer. One is over there, one is over there.
We have a word in English for it. It starts with a B.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Well, mine starts with a P, but okay. So you get the point, right? You get the point. I became an intuitive interpreter, which means I left a lot of information out that I considered irrelevant, unnecessary. I go to court and I bring that intuition with me. So when I interpreted in court, when I started, I am sure that I followed the same process. I interpreted, transmitted it without any extras, just the basics. And the courts thought that that was okay until they started realizing that a lot of things were being left out or misinterpreted. So when they started asking us to do things, no, you have to interpret the whole thing, then we discovered that our memory was not that good, right? That because all those things that I was leaving out, apparently I didn't have the right to leave out. All of a sudden I had to, and nobody trained me on that. And why I have discovered now is this: in my opinion, good interpreters learn to be counterintuitive. In other words, you have to go against what comes naturally. What comes naturally is that when you interpret for somebody, you do it in the consecutive mode. Right? You do it in the consecutive mode. That's natural. He wants to know this. She said that. That's natural. Which means you leave out information, and when somebody tells you interpret simultaneously, that's completely unnatural. It's counterintuitive. And because nobody trained us, then we did the best we could. And I'm going to tell you what happened when you do simultaneous, because after all, simultaneous is what we're here to talk about, right? We're here to talk about simultaneous. Now, let me ask you a question. Many of you maybe have seen this presentation already, so good. If not, for those of you who haven't, what is the best way to study and practice simultaneous?
Talking to a mirror.
Talking to a mirror, okay? TV, record and listen. So, what is the best way to get better at simultaneous?
Shadowing.
Shadowing, right? You're all right. The best way to learn simultaneous is sight translation, of course. Of course. Sight translation. Isn't that completely counterintuitive? It took me many years to realize this, people. Most of us court interpreters completely ignore sight translation and consider it the least important, the least effective part of interpretation. And if you ask many court interpreters, they might even tell you, we don't even do that much side translation. Which might or might not be true. We're going to talk about protective orders, and each one of you has a protective order sample or two in your binder. Did you see them? Well, if the person doesn't speak English or doesn't read English, guess who's going to be side translating that for them? You are. Which means we actually do a lot of side translation. We just don't notice it. Every time a form has to be conveyed to a person who doesn't speak English, you have to do side translation. But side translation is the least intuitive and the least taught mode of interpretation. Well, I'm here to tell you that if you want to get good at this, you need to start backwards. And you want to be good at simultaneous, let's talk about side translation first. And in side translation, there's certain rules. There's certain golden rules, and I've always had mine, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But in side translation, there is a golden rule. Does anybody remember what is the golden rule?
Read the whole document first.
Thank you very much. At least somebody still remembers. Never, ever, ever start a side translation without reading the whole document first. Now, it's interesting because we say this during the orientation to everybody who took the orientation. And then when we do the skill building training, people come. More than half of the people in that class, guess how soon they start the side translation? Immediately.
Sometimes you ask for do that, and they think it is you lost time. If you ask 2-3 minutes for reading the entire paper before you do the translation, they say,
Right.
why you don't do this?
Right.
Read that.
Right.
Because
And-
they don't understand.
Because they don't. And that's a question that, has to be answered over and over again. And Hannah talked about it this morning, people. That is a fact. Most people don't know what our job is. That's why we have to know what our job is, so we can tell people how to let us do our job. Because if somebody says, please read this, and I say, may I have, the interpreter is unfamiliar with the document, may I have it for, and they tell me no, then you say on the record, well, the interpreter cannot ascertain his or her ability to accurately side translate the document. It's on the record, yes, sir?
How about the counterintuitive side translation as a vehicle for understanding simultaneous interpreting? Yet, the very point that we need to read the whole thing first counters the idea of side translation as a vehicle for understanding simultaneous interpreting. Because when you are interpreting on the fly, you don't have the whole thing.
You would think so, wouldn't you?
That's my
I'm going to tell you why I say, but you see, it is certainly counterintuitive, isn't it? Because I said you have to read it first. Let me show you what actually side translation and simultaneous are kissing cousins. Why? Because in side translation, the first thing you have to do is something called reading for content. And what does that mean? Reading for content. Well, I always say that the source is the key. Does anybody remember what I mean when I say the source is the key?
If you don't understand the source, you can't interpret it into another language.
Right, and what is the source? The source?
The meaning.
The source? Language. The source language is the key. Right? For side translation, the source language is the key. And we said if you don't understand the source, the rest is irrelevant. But what is the biggest problem with interpreters? Because we don't know how to do things. They give us a paper, and when they give us a paper, what's the first thing we do? As soon as we start thinking, oh my God, how am I going to say children? Or risk? Or spank? Right? How am I going to say that in Portuguese? And guess what? The moment that I start reading and thinking, how am I going to say this in the other language? The rest is gone. And that has happened to us because when we're reading a text and something distracts us, we can continue to read the text, but we no longer know what it means. And that's why when somebody's new name comes and you say, where did Bobby come from? Is because you were not really attending that event anymore. Do you agree? So, reading for content, the source is the key, is because your obligation as interpreters is to understand the meaning in the source matter. So let me pass this around. I think there's enough for the table. I bought 30 some of them, so I'm hoping that we have enough for everybody. And if you're missing, then if somebody has extra, please. Don't read them yet, please, by the way. Put them face down. You know, in my experience, who are the worst followers of instructions? Interpreters. They should be the best. You know, I said it 3 times and people are still reading their document right now. Yes.
Just a tidbit behind teachers.
Yeah, exactly. Just right behind teachers. Yes, ma'am.
If not for this exercise, but later I feel you may want to look at some dictionaries. Some of you may be using them on your smartphones. So the password is downtown. The wireless network is PHH, Bravo Hotel, or PHH Conf. So there are 3 different options for the wireless network, and lowercase downtown.
Thank you, darling. All right, people. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to read this for content, meaning I want you to read it in English. I want you to make an effort not to translate anything in your head. All right? I want you to read in English, understand it in English. Any questions? Did everybody get one of these? Yes? All right. Ready, set, go. If you finish reading it before the 2 minutes, just read it again. And again. Time's up. All right. How many of you read it more than once? See? So 2 minutes is a long time to read 250 words. I want you to keep that in mind because sometimes people say, well, there's no time. Even 1 minute would be probably enough to get at least one reading of this whole document. All right. Now that you read the document, can anybody quickly tell me what the document is about without looking at it?
I have a question. It's a good exercise. I'm wondering what's going on. I had to stop on every paragraph and start over because knowing the purpose of this, I wanted to translate things. And I had to go back.
And I asked you not to.
I know. And it was automatic.
I know. And that is the problem, people, that because we're not trained interpreters, we're always constantly fighting to try to do what we think needs to be done, as opposed to what would, in the end, will help us better. So it's just a matter of forcing your brain and practicing, not translating. Don't worry about it. I want you to understand it in English. Imagine that you're going to have to explain it to somebody in English, that they don't speak any other language. That your 8-year-old child wants to know what that means in English. So, for the rest of you, what was that all about?
Well, it seems the most thing is the immediate risk of harm to the children.
Yes.
Basic,
And we're talking about physical, emotional, and the fact that the wife was unable to protect her children.
Right, because? Right. So what's the guy's name, by the way?
Ross.
And what's one of the children's names?
Ariel.
And the woman?
Renee.
Oh, okay, and she's the one that... So you see how much you know about this? If you were asked to do a side translation after all this, I guarantee you that you would do a much better job putting it into any other language that if you didn't read it first. That if you were concentrating, how am I going to say this particular word? Because if you're not concentrating on how am I going to say regardless, and then my brain starts saying, well, there's no word for regardless in Mongolian. And I start fighting with my own brain about how it's going to be impossible to say that, or maybe there is a word, but I'm thinking, how do you say regardless? But I'm missing the point. The point is not how do you say regardless in Mongolian, is what does it mean in English, because my job is going to be to transfer the meaning into the other language, not the words. You cannot say a word means something unless you understand the context in which the word was used. That's why it's very inefficient for interpreters to try to interpret or translate while they're reading. Because then they, like you said, you constantly have to stop. How am I going to say this? Who cares? The first question is, do you understand it? So then you can put it into another language. You want to say something?
Well, yeah, it was only 2 or 3 weeks ago, an attorney had to take something into the judge in chambers, gave me the document, sticks the document in my face, says, what is this? And I'm trying to read it, but someone's reading that like that, you know. I said it's a death certificate and handed it back.
Okay,
Just
that's
to get the
fine.
context.
Yeah, but that's not, you know, that's not a side translation, right? But don't allow attorneys, judges, or anybody to impede you from doing your job. You have a job to do, and you have a responsibility, and you have a code of ethics to follow. All right, so do we understand that? Because I want to move quickly to the next step, chunking. And what is chunking? Chunking is breaking something into smaller pieces without changing their meaning. Chunking is very clear for people in something that is written down when you think big picture. A book. Isn't a book already chunked for us?
Chapters.
Right. And those are chunked for us, aren't they?
Paragraphs.
And those are chunked for us, aren't they?
Sentences.
Right. Well, sometimes even a sentence might be chunked. So the concept of a chunk, we understand it, is a unit of meaning. For interpreting purposes, a chunk is the smallest unit of meaning. And the whole idea of a chunk is that it has to have meaning on its own, and that it cannot change with the interpretation of the next chunk. In other words, I was standing next to the cat could be a good chunk unless the next word was walk. So we have to be cognizant that we have to chunk it in the original source language. It has to have meaning in the source language. Not how am I going to say it. It has to have meaning in the source language. Is that clear? Grab a pen. I'll give you a minute and a half. Let's chunk this document. Ready, set, go. In other words, we're going to read in the source language, and as we are reading, draw a slash at the end of any chunks that you find. Don't worry about how you're going to say it in the other language. Just chunk it in English. All done? Wow. Okay, time's up. Okay, so how many chunks did we come up with? Many. Some more than others, right? Since chunking is a personal decision, we did say it's the smallest unit of meaning. So in theory, we should have many. Who wants to mention one of their chunks? Not everybody at the same time. Go ahead.
The children are in immediate risk of serious harm.
Bang. Did anybody consider that a chunk? Right, that's a good chunk, right? It is a unit of meaning, it's not gonna change anything. So listen to this, the idea of doing a side translation in chunks means that I can concentrate all my brain power on resolving that linguistic problem. And when that is solved, then I move to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And that's how you do side translation, by concentrating only on the task at hand. And then move to the next one, and the next one. And the delivery, which is how you say it, is the most important part of a side translation. Because the interpreter has to learn this technique. This is a chunk, very good. The interpreter reads the chunk to whom? To him or herself. In what language? Soft language. Has the interpreter said anything yet?
No.
Absolutely nothing. Then, the interpreter transforms that message into the same message in the target language. And when he has accomplished that, for the first time, the interpreter starts saying something. Interpret. But guess what we are doing while we're interpreting that chunk?
Looking at the next chunk.
We're reading the next chunk. And then, after I said this, and I read this, and I transformed it, then I say it. Does that make sense? That is a technical difference in what we used to do. What we used to do is to read this. First of all, we didn't chunk, many of us. You know the only chunks we were doing? Per word. Let me do this word, and then this word, and then that's why many of the side translations that interpreters do sound weird in the other language. Because they're a word by word translation, which sometimes sounds very stilted in the other language. Because in many languages, we actually have to switch the word order so it sounds more like that language. Is this making sense? Next time you listen to yourself, listen to your side translations, and you'll notice, like they say, soy el hermano de Juan in Spanish. How do you say that in English? I'm Juan's brother. But if I'm paying attention to each word, I would say, I am the brother of Juan. Which is not horrible, but doesn't it sound weird in English? I'm the brother of Juan. Because in English you would say, I'm Juan's brother. And that is what happens when you try to go word by word. But when you go chunk by chunk, and when you're reading ahead, that means that you're doing one thing, talking, but you're also reading. Musicians find this very easy to do because that's what they do when they play music. They're reading ahead. They're not playing the note they're looking at. They're playing the note that they just read, and they're preparing for the next note. Well, some people say, well, I'm not a musician. No problem. Do you drive? Yes? Good. Because when you drive, you're driving, but you're anticipating when you're turning, when you're taking that exit, etc., etc. So you're always reading ahead. Keep this image in mind, because when you're doing side translation, and you should do these exercises of side translation, and we talked about it, because you have to practice how you deliver. So reading aloud permits you to practice how to say things. And by the way, I always suggest that you do the side translation in the language you speak the most in court. So I would be reading a document in Spanish out loud to practice my delivery in Spanish. Now, let's go back to...
Excuse me, do
Yes.
you mean reading it aloud in
The language is written as a practice.
okay.
Why? Because before I can interpret, I should be able to deliver properly. Right? So I recommend a lot of reading out loud and doing expansion and compression exercises to prepare for then being able to do side translation. Now, let's talk quickly about simultaneous. Simultaneous, is it really simultaneous?
Time delay,
Huh?
slightly time delay.
It is, right? When the first time I heard the word simultaneous, I thought that I really needed to do it simultaneously. And then the judge said, the long, hard, rocky, and difficult, and guess what I could say in Spanish?
Waiting for the
I
now.
don't know.
I don't have no noun. Notice my perfect grammar here. I don't have no noun, therefore I could say nothing in Spanish. For those of you who don't speak Spanish, because gender is important in Spanish, and the agreement between the noun and the adjectives has to be also gendered, and I think that's true probably in French for sure, and Arabic maybe, in French, in Russian, yes? So I still could, in Portuguese too, I couldn't say anything until somebody, please tell me a noun. And very quickly I discovered I cannot interpret this adjective until I have a noun. So simultaneous, and this is an active reporting of a person, if this is the original speaker, the interpreter tried to say something but couldn't. Right? And they got trapped until they heard the noun. And this is the interpreter speaking. Now, if you notice, the interpreter started after this guy, and in theory, finished after the guy. That makes sense, right? Except when we started testing interpreters, untrained interpreters in the courts, this is what was really happening. This is the recording of a judge speaking. You must, by now we all know that when that is happening, that means that the person is speaking. And when that is happening, they're not saying anything. Well, what we discovered very quickly is that the person, when they're speaking extemporaneously like I am, they're gonna have all these lacunas, these pauses, some longer than others, right? And these are necessary for the speaker because they need what? To breathe. Good. They need to breathe. Right. They need to gather their thoughts. They need to maybe make a point by saying, think about it, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Then they stop so you can think about it. So all those pauses were happening. When we recorded the interpreters and we put them together with the recording of the judge, this is how they look like. You notice something interesting? They started late, right? But they finished almost exactly at the same time. Every time. See this? Starting late. They're kind of late, but not a lot later, not this much later. Look at this one. Almost identical, right? And to accomplish this, the interpreters only had two alternatives. What and what? Or go faster or omit stuff. And guess what? They were doing both. They were omitting and they were going faster. That's why the main complaint is and again and again. So the trained interpreters were neither going faster nor skipping. They learned that the technique is this. Here's a speaker. Here's the untrained interpreter. Shorter arrows, meaning skipping, or the professional interpreter. They talk through the pauses. Every time. That's a trained interpreter. And that takes practice. And it should look something like this. The interpreter hears a chunk, formulates an idea of how to say the chunk, thinks it in the target language, interprets it into the target language, and while he or she is doing that, guess what they're doing?
They're listening.
Now we see the connection? Listening and training your brain to be able to do two tracks. One that is paying attention to the meaning in the source, whether it's read or listened to. and a different one producing it, and being able to continuously do it ahead of time is how you do both simultaneous and side. And that's why side translation helps you, not necessarily with the mechanics of simultaneous, but with the idea of simultaneous. First understand, then say it, and it is possible to always be behind. Yes?
To continue from the start to the end, it's almost the same. Could it be that the judge made a conscious decision to slow down so that the simultaneous interpreter could catch up with the rate of speed of speech?
That could be, but remember, that not always helps. We have tried. It's very funny. Sometimes you tell the judge, can you go a little slower, Your Honor? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right. The long, hard, rocky, difficult, and here I am. And they're looking at me like, when are you going to start? So going slower as a word going slower does not help me. The whole pace going slower absolutely helps, but not just reducing the spaces between the words. But yes, and actually one of the things we train attorneys and judges to do is to try to go slower in general, not just word by word. You have a question back there, Sebastian?
Yeah, I mean, I will admit that I'm not familiar with that language in Brown. Absolute measure, what is that? What does that mean?
There's no language at all. It's an invented gibberish.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Not even baka, it's just nothing. That is a very, it's a placeholder. People that write things that they want to show you how a book is going to look like or how something, they use this ipso necessarum just to fill out the, it looks a little bit like Latin, but it's actually gibberish. Means nothing. Yes?
As I have seen in the court here in Maine, as soon as the judge learns that there is an interpreter, they start to go slow. For the benefit of the interpreter. So
Fantastic. That's good to hear.
yes.
I just hope they don't go that slow that they go the long, hard. Yes?
Going back to the earlier slides, you put the expansion and compression exercises,
Mm-hmm.
but what are those exercises?
We'll talk about them. I'll
Okay.
talk to you because you should know by now, and I really didn't want to go through them because I'm running completely out of time, and I wanted to do an exercise. Yes, sir.
Yeah, sometimes we have to ask for pauses. Some attorneys
Absolutely.
tend to just keep going non-stop, just to call to their attention that there is an interpreter. You know.
Absolutely, and I tell you a secret, just don't tell the judge this. Sometimes, especially in trials, even if I can keep the pace, every now and then, I go, excuse me, Your Honor, an interpreter cannot keep that pace, to remind them that I am there. Because you're right, sometimes when we're really good, then they forget we're there and they start going faster and faster and faster. So yes, sometimes, but here's to empower you that if you need to ask them to slow down, you can. And according to your code of ethics, not only you can, you must. So, let's just go back and see if this helps. You already chunked your document, right? I'm going to give you 1.5 minutes to read out loud, in other words, side translate this document. Now I really do want you to translate it, but I want you to side translate the first chunk, and while you're saying it, I want you to read the next one. I want you to side translate this document chunk by chunk. I'll give you 1.5 minutes. Go ahead and do it. Now, if somebody got stuck in a word, as a concept, in a chunk, let us know and maybe we can help you out. Whisper mode, everybody. Done? I know. I don't care. They can skip their lunch. It's okay. I'm thinking of it because we have we steal 5 minutes from the. Very slow. Exactly. Interpreter's hungry. All right. Even if you didn't finish, do you think that you found it easier to side translate this because you had read it and chunked it?
Yes, indeed, yes.